So, and again, I was fortunate enough that I got, well, if it were me, I was able to teach, there we go, Nebraska history at Peru State College, the first college in the state for many, many years, over 30 years. So, I could talk about Nebraska history for an entire semester. So you're getting the Cliff Note versions here today. So it actually begins in 1844. Because in 1844, the first bill was introduced to take what had been called the permanent Indian frontier, gives a whole new meaning to the word permanent. A bill was introduced to create the Nebraska Territory. And at the time, it was basically pretty much all of the Louisiana territory from 3630 north. You'll see where 3630 comes on in a little bit. At the time, the senator who was chair of the Committee on Territories was a name you might recognize, Senator Stephen Douglas, from a small hamlet on the shores of Lake Michigan, which today we would know as Chicago. But it was not a very large town at the time. So he was in the perfect position as the chairman of the Committee on Territories to develop this bill, and you'll see how it plays in politically big time. So this is a map of the United States in 1854 when the bill was finally passed. And as the bill got debated, the big question in the 1840s and then became an even bigger question in the 1850s was, if we open those territories, what was the big issue? Slavery. Whether those territories would allow slavery or not. Well, if you recall, and hopefully you can kind of see, the orange area are the areas that allowed slavery, and of course the green did not allow slavery, including California. But that kind of gold area in the middle, or the Louisiana Purchase, it had said that there would be no slavery north of, in the Missouri Compromise when they brought Missouri in. And Missouri is slave, Maine is free. They said no slavery in that area we know as the Louisiana Territory above the 3630 line. Well, that would mean that if we're going to create a new Nebraska Territory, that it would all be above the 3630 line. Well, so guess who wouldn't vote for that? Yeah, anybody from the southern states. And so, and guess who also had some political presidential ambitions? Stephen Douglas did. And so he came up with this concept of, well, let's create two territories. We'll create a Kansas territory, and then we'll also create a Nebraska territory. So first off, I need to ask, is there anybody in Kansas here before I insult them? Oh, Nancy. Anyway, the bill was called a Bill for the Creation of the Nebraska Territory. And and for various purposes, slavery being one of them, the question of slave state versus free state, when they decided to create two territories, they called the bill for the creation of the Nebraska and Kansas territories. And then they didn't have cut and paste back in the day, but basically that's what they did, and just used the word Kansas. So I guess my point is that we know it today as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that's just wrong. It should be the Nebraska-Kansas Act, if you look at the official name of the bill. Kansas was, again, not to offend anybody, but a second thought as they went on. But we'll come to the other issue for Douglas here in a second. But here you can see the outlines of the Nebraska Territory, and they're huge. Most people don't realize that originally this was actually a very large territory. Included all of present-day Nebraska. It's basically bordered on the east by the Missouri River. There's a little bit of straight line right there at the top to go up to the Canadian border. And then, of course, the Canadian border, and then it's the crest of the Continental Divide, and then down to the 40th parallel. Eventually, what they will do when they're carving it into states is the Red River of Texas is the northern boundary, and then Oklahoma's northern boundary is the 37. Between Nebraska and Kansas is the 40th. Between Nebraska and South Dakota is the 43rd. Between North Dakota and South Dakota is the 46th. And then the Canadian border is the 49th. So there's basically 3 degrees of height in all those states in the middle. So if you ever look at them, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, they're all 3 degrees high. Oklahoma's a little funky, but it's Oklahoma, so just let it be. Anyhow, that was, and the bill did pass in May 30th of 1854. So it was a 10-year debate. So, you know, Congress sometimes moves slowly, as we all know. Okay. The bigger point is the impact of the Kansas-Nebraska bill. First off, it abandoned the permanent Indian frontier. So, again, sometimes when we celebrate the beginning of Nebraska as a political entity, didn't necessarily have as good as future for those who were of the indigenous population, because again, this area prior to 1854, although there were many other people crossing the Great Plains, Oregon Trail obviously, they were just passing through. Now we're coming to stay. So it signaled the end of the permanent Indian frontier, and it would pave the way for, and notice how I have the Transcontinental Railroad. Why do you think I use the word the? Because at the time, no one thought there'd be more than one. You know, they're so expensive to build, and there's not that many people out there, et cetera, et cetera. So there had been a lot of talk about building a transcontinental railroad. The Secretary of, I believe it was called, well, it was Secretary of War back in the day. Now we call it Defense. Sounds much more politically correct. The Secretary of War back in the 1850s was a man by the name of Jefferson Davis. Name might ring a bell. He'll go on to be the president of the Confederacy. Well, obviously he's a Southerner, and he wanted the Transcontinental Railroad to go through Texas, and then he was instrumental in buying the Gadsden Purchase, kind of that lower segment of Arizona, because it had the Gila River Valley, and that would have been a great river route, because they're trying to connect to California. California had become a state, 1850, and we want to connect it to the rest of the United States. So he was proposing this southern route. Guess who wanted a route through the middle of the country? I've already said his name. Douglas. Douglas won. And why would Douglas want a route through the middle of the country instead of a southern route? Well, he's from Illinois. He's from Illinois. Let me back up just a moment to that other map and take a look at it again. If you look at this, I should have brought like a laser point, but if you look at this and think about where Chicago is, and actually I do have a little black dot, if you can see that up there. And then down below, you'll see another black dot, and that would be St. Louis, which was a much, much larger town in the early 1850s. And if you'll see what territory is directly across from St. Louis, it's still there, it's still the same state, Kansas. But what territory is across from Chicago? Nebraska. So not only did he want to divide it into 2 territories so that his idea was one would likely go slave and one would likely go free in terms of the slavery question, therefore pacifying everybody for a potential presidential bid. But also, if you're going to build a transcontinental railroad, where would a likely hub for those eastern railroads be? In St. Louis or Chicago? Well, but if you're going to, go west, then you need to have a territorial capital. So if you wonder why Nebraska has a territorial capital called Omaha City, that's what they called it at the time, take a look at where Omaha City is relative to Chicago. Douglas he was He was thinking, he was planning ahead. Yeah, so you have two territories, and then you have two territorial capitals, and then maybe one of them can be the headquarters for the Union Pacific to build westward. Ah, yes, he was thinking. Okay, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act abolished the permanent Indian frontier and paved the way for the Transcontinental Railroad. It would also end the agreement that they had made in the Missouri Compromise that said, again, I'm going to come back to that everything above the 3630 parallel would be forever free. So now you know how long forever is. It's 34 years. 1820 to 1854. And as a result of that, that truly lit the flame under the abolitionists, because they thought that, as long as we could keep slavery in the southern states and not let it expand, and they had one in California. Oh, I'm going to throw this in. They won in California, and I don't mean to be cruel about this, but just, again, you have to put yourselves in that time period. You can't judge people by the 21st standards. You have to judge them by the 1850s. California didn't want slavery because they didn't want rich people to bring their slaves and pan for gold. It wasn't that there were some great humanitarians out there panning for gold. They just didn't want slaves competing with them. And that's why California asked to be admitted as a free state. Again, not to judge again, if you're a miner, that's who mainly was living out there, you would probably like that as well. Okay. Anyway, as a result, that the Missouri Compromise was now invalidated and that forever had ended, that's what invigorated the Republican Party. The Republican Party was formed directly as a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They formed in Ripon, Wisconsin, and if you go back and look at the specific dates, they were formed slightly before May 30th of 1854, but that had been the big debate. They knew that this was coming. And they knew that Congress was going to pass this bill. And a group of men met in Ripon, Wisconsin and said, what happened to forever free? And we're going to start a party that's opposed. They weren't, and originally, and again, if you know your Abraham Lincoln story, it wasn't that they wanted to end slavery, they just didn't want it to spread. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which said that the territories could decide via popular sovereignty whether they would be free or slave, allowed for the spread of slavery. And that's what they were opposed to. So that was the catalyst for the Republican Party in 1854. I believe it's late March of 1854 that the party officially began. So, when you think about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's a huge cause of that formation of that party. So, we are a territory. At the time, it's still true today, when territories are formed, the president gets to appoint the territorial governors. And again, there's very few people, other than obviously indigenous people living in Nebraska. And people are coming in and out. Some may come, get here, say no way, head back, crossing back and forth. A lot of that happened between Missouri and Kansas, because other than that little northeast corner, going from Missouri to Kansas is like stepping from here to here. It's just a piece of land. In Nebraska, it was a little tougher to go from Iowa to Nebraska territory because, of course, you had the Missouri River, and there were no bridges at the time. So there were some ferries, which will come up here in a second. Anyhow, he appoints Francis Burt from South Carolina. I don't know, again, if you know your Civil War history, but the first state to secede, South Carolina. And they have one of the highest populations of slavery there. So it seems kind of strange that we would get a slave state territorial governor, but that's who it was. So he comes up the Missouri River from St. Louis and up. He gets off at Bellevue. And of course that made the few people at Bellevue happy. Peter Sarker's trading post was there, and they assumed that meant that this will be the territorial capital. However, he was sick when he got off, he was bedridden, and he died 3 days later without saying what his intent was. Okay, not a good start for the state or the territory when your first territorial governor dies 3 days after coming. So at that point, this territorial secretary, who had also been appointed by the president, a guy by the name of Cummings, who owned stock in the Council Bluffs Ferry Company. There's a little conflict of interest. He becomes acting territorial governor. And of course, everybody's trying to, people are coming in, they're trying to elect territorial legislators, and kind of it's a real flowing situation. He decides to take a census of where most people lived. And again, they're pretty much all along the Missouri River, from Rouleau, Brownville, Nebraska City. Plattsmouth actually isn't even incorporated until 1857. Omaha City's about as far north as those early towns, and it literally, when you're going, why does she keep saying Omaha City? That's what they called it. Because again, think about this: Omaha City, Brownville. Which one do you think has a bigger chance of becoming a city? So yeah, they called it Omaha City. Well, Council Bluffs as a town already existed. And in fact, when Lincoln comes out to talk about the the Transcontinental Railroad, he will come to Council Bluffs. So Council Bluffs as a town existed. They had a ferry company. Cummings had financial interest in that ferry company. And the ferry company said, if you will pick Omaha City as your territorial capital, we will donate the first building. Now, it wasn't much, but it was a building. So Cummings said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll take this census and see where most people live. They did the census, and again, you have to know it wasn't particularly accurate, because again, people are coming and going. Twice as many people living south of the Platte as north of the Platte. But let's put the territorial capital north of the Platte. So right away, Cummings is very much facing anger by those who live south of the Platte. So in early territorial politics in Nebraska, the fight was South Platters versus North Platters, more so than it was Democrats and Republicans. South Platters feeling like they had the territorial capital stolen from them. And that little rivalry of Omaha City and Lincoln still has a little bit of rivalry today. So you can see where it began. And we'll talk more as we move towards statehood. There you go. Okay. Covered everything. Again, the first territorial capital building donated by the Council Bluffs Ferry Company, because there is no bridge. So to get across, you've got pretty much, you wouldn't want to swim it. Even back then, the Missouri wasn't channeled, but the channels were too swift in changing to be certain of crossing. And it was just a small wooden building right near the actual river itself, which they quickly outgrew, and so they built a second, more substantial building up on the hill, and that is where Omaha High School is today, if you've ever been there. And there's a historical marker. So it has a great view kind of down into downtown Omaha is where that was at. But now to talk a little bit about the Transcontinental Railroad. Again, now that we have a governmental entity out here, it will be much easier to build a railroad across here than if there was still the permanent Indian frontier. And two territorial capitals, again, allowed for a population base. And of course, when President Lincoln does take office in March of '61, one of the first things that Congress will do is they actually will pass three major acts that they had been trying to pass, and the southern states kept blocking in the U.S. Senate, because again, they had enough votes, that tit for tat, as many slaves. And so how did it get passed then when Lincoln became president? And it's not just his charismatic personality, although he did have that, but why did all these acts that they couldn't get passed now? The South had seceded. You can't vote against a bill if you're not there to vote. And so it was the Moral Land Grant Act. That's the act that set up money to give to states for a liberal arts college and a agricultural and mechanical college, an A&M college. I'll come back to that when we talk about Lincoln in a second. The Homestead Act, which of course opened land for settlement. Again, Homestead down there in Beatrice, Nebraska. And then what they call the Pacific Railway Act, which is the Transcontinental Railroad. Lincoln signed it into law. He came out and said Council Bluffs would be the point at which the Union Pacific will build westward, because there were some rail lines across Iowa. Iowa had been a state since 1846. So there were a few rail lines across Iowa already, and one into Council Bluffs. But of course, for all practical purposes, it literally started in Omaha because there was no railroad bridge. Yeah. So, and of course, Union Pacific is still headquartered in Omaha today. So that had huge implications for the state of Nebraska and Omaha in specific. Okay. So, I had mentioned the term that the Kansas-Nebraska Act said that the issue of slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty. That had been used in the Compromise of 1850 for New Mexico, and would be the New Mexico Territory, which is basically New Mexico and Arizona, and the Utah Territory, which is basically Utah and Nevada. And that hadn't caused quite the stir that the Kansas-Nebraska Act did, because they hadn't been part of the Missouri Compromise. That's not in the Louisiana Purchase area. And so, although the abolitionists hadn't liked it, nobody thought the desert area was going to be conducive to slavery anyway. But when they did the Kansas-Nebraska Act 4 years later, and they came up with the same concept of, let's let the people decide whether they want slavery or not, that invigorated the abolitionists, because the potential for slavery in Kansas and Nebraska they thought was more likely, particularly in Kansas. And so that would invigorate them. So Nebraska, and think about this too. I'm going to go back to Senator Douglas. What sounds more democratic if you're trying to get a popular support than to let the people of the territory vote whether they want slavery or not? So again, he was pandering for votes, as I won't say all politicians, but he's thinking ahead. I'll make everybody happy because they'll get to vote. I won't be saying one way or the other. So the Nebraska territory, the very common thought was Kansas will go slave and Nebraska will go free. I mean, again, kind of keep this balancing act going. Kansas is right next to Missouri. And in those early days, as I'm sure you know from your days in the classroom, that a lot of those Missouri, they called them bushwhackers. They came out of Missouri, they were called bushwhackers, pro-slaveryites. They would come into Kansas, and in many cases they came in, voted, went back home. Because they wanted Kansas to go slave because it's right next to them, which again makes sense in their particular case. So the thought was Kansas will go slave, and you all know the Bleeding Kansas stories, and Nebraska will go free. Early on, Nebraska voted multiple times to be a free state, or territory, to be a free territory. I want to say, do I have it up there? 3 times? I think they voted 3 times. As a territorial legislature, to be a free territory. Each time the territorial governor, and we had multiple territorial governors during the years that we were a territory, because we're going to be a territory for 13 years. Every time the territorial governor vetoed it, and it could never override. And the reason the territorial governor vetoed it every time is he said it was unconstitutional to ban slavery in a territory, because you might remember the famous Supreme Court case of Dred Scott, because the Dred Scott decision said that states are sovereign entities. Sovereign means that they're kind of like they're full-grown adults, that they can govern themselves. Territories are children, and they therefore are under the auspices of the federal government. And so Dred Scott had said no territory could ban slavery, but a state could. And so all I need, and it was different territorial governors, vetoed our attempt to ban slavery in Nebraska. I will tell you, well, maybe I have it up there, yeah, that in 1860, when we took our next formal census, there were 15 slaves in Nebraska, most of them in Nebraska City. The freighting firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, if you've heard much about them, they were the biggest freighting firm, had a government contract, which was to supply the western forts. Government contracts were lucrative back in those days as well. Majors had Majors of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, and they were also the firm that eventually will do the Pony Express. Majors had slaves. Nuckols, who is considered the founder of Nebraska City. In fact, we have a park right downtown Nebraska City. I'm from Nebraska City, just to clarify that, is Nuckols Square, because he was the founder of the city of Nebraska City. He had slaves. Judge Hawley had slaves, men of substance. I have been asked, so I'll clarify this. J. Sterling Morton did not have slaves. He had some servants who were black, but they were paid, and they slept elsewhere. They didn't live with the Morton family. So anyhow, most were there. 5 out in Buffalo County around the Fort Kearny area. I imagine they were with some of the military officers out there as well. So there were 15 in the census of 1860. So Nebraska did get involved a little bit with the Underground Railroad. When I had a sabbatical from the college, I did do some research. I wanted to do a first-person portrayal, and that is the first-person portrayal that I continue to do for the Nebraska Humanities Council Speakers Bureau. And I wanted to find a woman, thought it would be easier to portray one. And I was kind of going through the list of possible topics, and I thought, well, I really wanted to talk about, the politics and history of Nebraska. And then I came across the Mayhew cabin in Nebraska City, which I knew about. Of course, back then it was known more by John Brown's Cave in Nebraska City. But I started doing the research on the Mayhew family and found out that Barbara Mayhew, her husband dies during the Civil War. She remarries another Underground Railroad person over in Iowa, goes to live with him. Between the two men, she had 11 children. And he then was shot in the back. They think some lingering abolitionist hatred, because he was an Underground Railroad conductor. And she comes back and lives with her dad on his cabin out by Camp Creek. And I looked at my husband, and he goes, yeah, it'd be right down there. And that's where Barbara Mayhew died, is about a half a mile at the bottom of the hill from where we live. And I thought, well, that might make sense if I portray her. And at the time, we were the same age as when she died. She was only 49 when she died. She had 11 kids, so I had 49. So anyhow, you can see there, so I did a lot of work on the Underground Railroad during my sabbatical, and tried to, a lot of it's folklore, and when I portray her, I always kind of joke that, I just listened to what the men folks said, because they typically didn't tell the women, and they certainly didn't tell the children. Because again, the fine, part of the Compromise of 1850 that brought California in, also had something called the Bloodhound Bill as part of it. And in there was a $5,000 fine or 5-year imprisonment or both for helping a runaway slave. So, of course, it was all on the hush. Barbara probably just tried to listen in. But we are able to document that on February 4th of 1859, her brother and John Brown were in the area, and that she fixed breakfast for 12 black people that morning. So, and that was the last time John Brown came through there. So that's that's a whole nother, that's my whole Speakers Bureau program. So if you want to know more about that, we could talk about that. But it does include in Nebraska, it's basically Falls City, Nemaha City. It stays west of Brownville, because Brownville was filled with those Missouri bushwhackers. And then up Peru, and then up through the Camp Creek area, which is where my husband and I live now, he farms, and then up to Nebraska City, and then from there they could cross over into Iowa. And Civil Bend and Tabor were very abolitionist towns in Iowa. From there they'd go to Chicago, and from Chicago they could get in the Great Lakes and get to Canada. And then the fugitive slave law did not apply in Canada, so Canada was the ultimate destination. Okay. Questions before I move on? Oh, you guys are very attentive. I love non-traditional age students. Yes?
When did the fugitive slave law become ineffective?
With the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, not until then.
During the early part of the Civil War,
yeah.
They still had,
yes,
because of the
fugitive
slave states that were still in the Union.
Well, so here's the, yeah, because you got those border states. Two quotes I throw in real fast. Somebody asked, the border states are the 5 states between the Confederates and they were all slave states. And somebody asked Lincoln one time, do you have Kentucky on your side? And he said, well, I hope I have, oh, no, he said, I had that backwards. Do you have God on your side? And he said, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. So here, and so to make that point, the Emancipation Proclamation set all slaves free in the rebellion states. So it didn't set the slaves free in the border states because he couldn't lose Kentucky. So does that make sense?
The fugitive slave law was still in effect for those?
For the border states. The fugitive slave law stays in effect until the 13th Amendment is ratified. You're right. But for the rebellious states, the Confederate states, it ends with the Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln, he was convinced, Frederick Douglass was huge in this. He got to see Lincoln in the White House, which black men were not allowed in the White House. But he got in there. And he talked to Lincoln and said, and Lincoln knew this, runaway slaves could not be used in the Union Army because they violated the fugitive slave law. They were violating their own federal law. So by declaring them free in the rebellious state, any runaway slave from the Confederacy could be enlisted in the U.S., in the Union Army. Does that make sense? And that was part of the argument for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, was then those black men could serve in the Union. Okay. Until then, they were not. Again, they were in segregated troops, but they couldn't. They were not allowed to enroll in the Union Army prior to the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah, good question. Oh, there's a little more detailed map. Because these maps are, they were drawn back in the day, and again, very secretive, because people didn't want to know. When I do my Barbara Mayhew, you might find this interesting. Every year I do a Barbara Mayhew program for some 4th graders out of Syracuse, and they go out to an Audubon Prairie area. So I walk in, like I've walked from Nebraska City with my hoop skirt, and of course, they're always like, well, where did they hide? And I said, well, maybe the first couple ones that came through, our brother John KG, who was the first in command of John Brown, John KG. I said, our brother, like I'm Barbara Mayhew. Sorry. I get in character of Barbara, and sometimes I forget who I am. Her brother, they believe that several came through during the years. We know the last one came through on that February of 1859. But they may have stayed in the Mayhew cabin, like maybe the first or second time, but then after that, I've read the news press, the Nebraska City News Press. It referred to the Mayhew cabin as that in Loving, so you fill that in, it's really ugly, abolitionist hole on the western edge of the city. So after that, they probably had nobody in their house or their cave. And they did have a cave for storing vegetables, fruit, as did everybody back in the day. I mean, it's their refrigerator. But as the kids look out on the prairie, I said, they just go lay down in the prairie. Because there's no drones. You know, you have to step on them to find them out there in that prairie. Because they're like, the grass is that tall. Because, you know, prairie grass can be pretty tall. Maybe not out here in Scouts Bluff. Back there it can be pretty tall. So there you go. Okay, moving on.
I'm curious.
Yes.
If Underground Railroad is a term that was used, but historians used it later, or was that used?
That was
at
used
the
then.
time?
It
Used
was.
that. But really, there wasn't a railroad.
No, it's a conduit, and it's not one route.
Right.
It's a conduit of route. It's a conduit of safe houses, is what it is.
But railroads were in the imagination
Yeah.
of the day. So
Well, that was the new mode of
Right,
transportation,
right.
yeah. And the way they would often, from my research, that they would know if this was a friendly area, is they'd say something like, well, are you sound on the goose? And if they're like, what are you talking about? Move on. So, if you were sympathetic to the abolitionists and runaway fugitive slaves, then you knew what sound on the goose meant. So, there was more stories, but again, Barbara Mayhew, Speakers Bureau. There you go. There is a picture of the Mayhew cabin in Nebraska City, and again, John K.G. was second in command. He was the first man killed at Harper's Ferry, by the way. And he's Barbara Mayhew's brother. So hence the connection there. I will also tell you this. It's held by a private foundation, and they've run into, during all the flooding we had back east in 2019, the cave collapsed. It's not the authentic cave, which I keep saying as a historian, it's not the original cave. But the foundation is mad, and so basically the cabin's kind of falling in. So we're hoping that eventually a solution will be found where the cabin can be saved, because it's truly that a tree hit part of it when it fell. Weeds are growing everywhere. So if you hear of the Mayhew cabin and know a solution for that, feel free to share with your state senator. Okay, into slavery. So when Lincoln is elected president in November of 1860, the current governor, who had a territorial governor, who had vetoed earlier bills, finally decided that, Abraham Lincoln's going to take over. So when another attempt at banning slavery in Nebraska is passed, the territorial governor does not veto. Because again, he knows he's going to be replaced in the next couple months. As soon as Lincoln takes office, a new territorial governor will be put in place. And so, again, Nebraska does not ban slavery until January of 1860. So a few months before Lincoln takes office and about 4 months before the Civil War begins. In fact, in December of 1860, again, it's in the news press of Nebraska City, Judge Hawley sold 2 of his slaves at an auction at 6th and Central, downtown Nebraska City. Not one of our finer moments for Nebraska City, but it's history. That's what happened. And he was a well-respected judge. But he had 2 slaves, and he saw the handwriting on the wall as well, and sold those 2 slaves in December 6th, 1860. Okay, Governor Saunders will be appointed, and again, he'll serve as the territorial governor throughout our territorial days, the remainder of our territorial days. Okay, so then the Civil War happens, and again, we're not a state, we're still a territory. As a territory, we weren't required, we weren't included in the draft and weren't required, but there were those who served voluntarily. The eventual governor, Furness from Brownville area, does in fact voluntarily sign up and will lead a regiment. And there were those who didn't want Nebraska to become a state. So in 1864, which again, if you're familiar with their Civil War history, we're toward the end of the Civil War. And Nebraskans did volunteer to serve in the Union Army, but they weren't required. in 1864, Congress sends out a request to the Nebraska Territorial Legislature, would you like to apply for statehood? Well, and I'm sure they were a little taken aback by it, because you were supposed to have 200,000 people by this time, and Nebraska wasn't there. But then they found out that they sent out the same request to Nevada as well. Would you like to become a state? And this is all in the fall of '64. What it was is that Lincoln was afraid he wouldn't win re-election. The war wasn't over yet, and we've had a lot of politicians who've worried they can't win the next election, and what can I do to cement my victory? And so the idea was that they believed that both Nebraska and Nevada, if they were states, would then have votes in the Electoral College. Because as a territory, you have no Electoral College votes. But as a state, you do. And so they sent out a request to both Nevada and Nebraska. The Democrats in Nebraska campaigned hard and vigorously against it because they saw it for the ploy that it was. Because again, we hadn't reached the minimum number of people to automatically qualify. And they argued too, our taxes will go up, it works every time. Works today. And they argued that our men would be constricted for the Civil War, and so they were able to defeat that intent, and we did not become a state in 1864. Nevada, however, did. They became a state in '64, just days before the presidential election, and they cast all 3 of their Electoral College votes for Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln won handedly. But again, there was fear by those earlier in the year that he would lose. So the reason why. So after the Civil War, the Nebraska Republican Party again pushed for statehood. And by that time, the Republican Party was pretty strong in the state of Nebraska. And so they called for a constitutional convention because that was the usual kind of process to follow. It did not, people came, left, went, and again, this is in Omaha City. And those, again, the Democratic Party opposed it. And they came away with nothing. And so then the territorial governor, again, a good Republican, having been appointed by Lincoln, he comes up with this idea of let's just, 5 minutes, stop the convention thing. And let's go directly to, let's create a constitution. So they basically copied Iowa's and put it to a vote of the people. So that's what they did. They passed it, they sent it to Congress. Congress says, oh, this is great, except, oh yeah, the 3-letter word, right? There we go. Come on. Okay. The exception was that they were in the process, they'd passed the 13th Amendment by this point, but they're still working on the 14th and 15th Amendment. 14th Amendment is kind of complicated. It's the equal rights protection. It's the one that includes naturalized citizens that we're having a big debate about today if you're born in the U.S. But the 15th Amendment was no state, because up until this time, states had full control of who voted in their state. Again, they're sovereign states. So up until this time, states decided who got to vote. So the 15th Amendment, which had been proposed but not yet ratified, said no state may deprive a person the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And when we adopted Iowa's Constitution, it only gave the vote to white men. So they said to Nebraska, you got to go back in and give it to all men. Sorry, women, they're not even talking about us yet. We're another 50 years down the road. So basically, they're saying to Nebraska, you have to pre-ratify the 15th Amendment, which came back to the Nebraska territorial legislature. Not a problem. There are not that many black men here. Again, not that that should have been the reason. But again, this is 1866, 67. So they send it back to Congress, and President Andrew Johnson vetoes our admission. We're the only state whose admission has been vetoed by the president. And not that he had anything against Nebraska, but he just believed it was unconstitutional to require Nebraska to have to put that in their constitution because we're a sovereign state and sovereign states gets to decide. So this is the First Amendment that required a state to allow a certain group of people to vote. That's why it took the 19th Amendment for women. Some states have given women the right to vote ahead of time, but to make every state do it, it took the 19th Amendment. Okay, and then by the way, that became the protocol for admitting those seceded states that came in. So let me do this real fast because this is the part I think some of you would really fight. So Congress overrides the veto. Johnson signs it. We become a state March 1, 1865, and again, pre-ratifying becomes the protocol for admitting slave states. So then they form a state commission of the state governor, the state auditor, and the secretary of state. They kind of drew a circle that included Iowa, the Platte River, down to Kansas. So it's really kind of a circle of southeast Nebraska. And they went out and looked, and they picked Lancaster. No railroad, no river. But it was kind of in the middle of where most of the people lived. And for some people, it was not Omaha City. That was the key. It just wasn't Omaha. And they, of course, they picked it, and no river, no railroad. Omaha City thought they were crazy. When they went to, so they're still meeting in Omaha, right? Omaha City. When they were trying to sign the bill, they're going to call it Capital City. So those Omaha City people came up with their final ploy to keep it in Omaha City. And that is, we'll make them call it Lincoln. Because there's some Democrats down there in that South Platte area, and they'd rather leave it in Omaha City than name it after that Republican president. So people like J. Sterling Morton probably swallowed real hard and said, really didn't want it named after a Republican, but I want it moved. And so that's how it became known. And of course, we are the first state admitted after the Civil War as a result of that. We do have a statue of Lincoln on the west side. You might notice that that's the second state capitol. That was put there in 1912. And then when they built the new state capitol, the one we have now, they literally had to move it and then put it back in place after they put that capitol. And the Daniel Chester French did this Lincoln first. And then when they were building the Lincoln Memorial, he submitted this as his prototype for what he would do if he got the statue in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And if you look at these two, this one's standing, the one on the mall in D.C. is sitting, but the shoulders and the head are the same. So we really have the beginning of that here in Lincoln, Nebraska. One quick thing, I'm not even sure I have a slide anymore. We really were the prelude to the Civil War. We forced the nation to settle some of the issues of slavery and black male suffrage, the 15th Amendment. But there was a continuing fight, and the story, if I had more time, would be a little bit about building the Capitol. We built it really fast, and that's why it fell down kind of 12 years later, because they needed to get it out of Omaha City and Lincoln, because for the first 2 years, they were still meeting in Omaha City, because they had no place to meet in Lincoln. So the rivalry between Lincoln and Omaha continues today a little bit on that. But they got the railroad. I think they're good. So there you go. Any questions? Yeah?
What were the states that allowed women to vote that you were talking about?
Wyoming. And in fact, they allowed women to vote before they became a state, like in their territorial stuff. And when they applied for admission, 1890, I believe, Congress wasn't going to admit them. They said, no, you can't have your women vote. And Wyoming said, you take our women or we won't come.
Way to go.
And Congress accepted. They figured out not that many women are going to vote out there in Wyoming. But if you think about it, Wyoming had a lot of homesteaders that were women.
Any other states, just that one?
I think some others allowed, not at the federal level, but in terms of like local elections and things like that. And in fact, Nebraska, before the 19th Amendment, allowed women to vote in local elections. And that was common for, local, but not the federal stuff.
That's amazing.
I say with sarcasm. You see my husband smiling. What else can I answer for you? Well, you guys have been a great audience. Thank you so very much. Hope it was informative.